Good morning, and welcome to the next panel discussion on framing the conversation on climate intersections. And I'm delighted because I'm joined by three professors on stage with me today. We have Professor Jamila Mahmood. She's a medical doctor. We have Professor Michael Kramer, who is a development economist. And we have also Professor Koh Lian Pin, who is a conservation scientist. But before I get into the contents and how we should think about framing this conversation on climate, I wanted to invite the panelists to very briefly introduce yourselves to the audience. And the challenge is that you have to tell us something that's not on Wikipedia, not on ChatGPT, and not on your resume. So if I could, Jamila, please start.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I think Wikipedia has everything about us, doesn't it? But I think the thing it doesn't know about me is that I'm actually a rugby fanatic. And I flew back from watching my wonderful team, All Blacks, lose to France to be here. And so that's something that I think ChatGPT didn't know before that.
Thank you, Jamila. And Michael?
I'm a development economist at the University of Chicago, which I guess is on Wikipedia. But I wanted to say that I had the opportunity to serve on a panel for the G20 on pandemic preparedness that was chaired by President Tharman. And it was a wonderful experience under his leadership, thanks to the values that he exhibited in every meeting of the Commission. The values of inclusiveness, of intellectual openness and rigor, and of commitment to the public good. And you asked us about our own values. I think we can all strive to emulate those values that President exhibits all the time.
Thank you, Michael. And Lian Pin?
Hi, everyone. My name is Lian Pin. I am a conservation scientist by training and currently a professor at the National University of Singapore. That's all on Wikipedia. I think the ones that are not on Wikipedia, I love hiking, so I try to be back in the Alps, the Swiss Alps, at least once or twice a year to hike.
Thank you. Thank you for that very personal sharing of your passions and some of your involvement in activities outside of your professional capacities. And today's conversation is around framing the conversation on climate intersections. Because as we know, climate is connected to everything else, and at the heart of it is really about us, people, right? And I wanted to start with you, Jamila, because when we talk about climate change, we think of cutting emissions, 2030, 2050 targets. It's good to have targets. It's a transition process. But the reality is that climate change is already upon us. Many of us have to be reminded that we're already at 1.2, right? And we promise ourselves that we're not going to get past 1.5. And we're experiencing extreme weather events in all parts of the world, developing economies, cities, as well as in the villages. And Jamila, you've been involved in humanitarian work with the UN, with the Red Cross, with Mercy Malaysia. And you have been supporting a lot of crisis responses on ground. Can you share with us some of your experience and how we can actually apply what you've learned in crisis responses to the way we think about the response to the climate crisis?
Thank you, Kim. One thing that probably isn't also on Wikipedia is I'm an obstetrician gynecologist, and I've delivered 15,000 babies in my career. And coming back to that very personal, sort of reproductive health background, I remember as a younger humanitarian in year 2000 when there was a terrible flood in Mozambique. And it was on all our television screens, if you remember, there was a woman clinging onto a mango tree giving birth to her child, and then South African rescue helicopter picking her up. Fast forward 2019, I was back in Mozambique. And I was telling the community I was working with that was impacted by the floods about this vision, this visual that I had been etched in my memory for so long. And one of the midwives pointed to a child and said to me, well, his mother just gave birth on a tree. And I said to myself, 19 years later, as a humanitarian, we're still facing the same problems. We've not moved because we haven't addressed the underlying causes of why the climate crisis is causing so many health issues. One, it's about health equity. Two, it's about looking at things from a planetary perspective. And that humanitarian assistance, while very critical in many circumstances, could actually turn out to be a band-aid on a huge gaping wound. So I think that what I'm driving at is we need systems changes. We need to look at the complexity of our world, what the UNDP Human Development Report has labeled the uncertainty complex that we live in, the dangerous changes of the Anthropocene, the global polarization of societies, and sweeping societal transformations. And I think until and unless we start applying a systems lens to the complexity of our world and recognizing that you need shifts in systems so that we don't end up, in silos. And I really urge you to read a brand new article that just came out in Nature, which I got this morning, from Ilona Kickbush, a real, solid health, global health expert, who talked about, the failing SDGs and why SDG 2.0, so to speak, must now be reframed around poverty reduction and health equity, and really taking a planetary health approach.
One of the characteristics of crisis is chaos.
Yes.
Right, and the need for coordination.
Yeah.
Right, and when we think about where we are today, right, many of us are past the why of climate change, right, and they're very well-intentioned individuals, entities who are willing to contribute. How should we coordinate ourselves? Because this is probably the greatest collective action problem that humanity is facing.
Yeah. You've touched on one of the most critical success factors, which is coordination. In the humanitarian sector, we often refer to it as the art of herding cats, because you can't herd cats, right? It's really difficult. But if you get it right, then what will happen is you actually meet the needs of people. And I want to put people at the center of all our conversations, whether it's research, whether it's philanthropy, whether it's humanitarian action. It's all about people. And if you start from there and realize that you need to listen to them first to figure out what they actually want and need, and not what you think they need, then the coordination process must be centered around that. Now, in philanthropy, the same applies. We've had the privilege of listening to a fascinating panel earlier, and it's so wonderful to see this, philanthropy is so vivid and alive in Asia. But what we now need to do is, again, applies that systems approach. So I think what you're doing with people, planet, peace and prosperity is very, very important. But how then do we really try to design for change and design for impact? I think that is something I would encourage the Alliance to do.
Thank you, Jamila. And if I may now turn to you, Michael, because you're known to be pushing the boundaries of innovation to look at alleviating global poverty. In fact, you won a Nobel Prize for that piece of work a few years ago. And I read about you actually advising governments to stockpile on ivory as a way to stop wildlife trade. It's not an obvious connection, but the idea, if I may paraphrase what you did, was to say, look, if you stockpile ivory, right, and you flood the market with ivory when the prices go up, it's a way to actually take away the incentives from the profiteers, from trying to get involved and doing more ivory business, right? And I know you've recently done some work in India around infant mortality and how that could be linked to water. Can you tell us more about how you think about these innovation tools as a way to address development issues?
Sure. So the work on ivory was at an earlier phase in my career when I was doing lots of theoretical economic modeling. And I think that's a lot of fun for people who are trained this way. But you can write models to generate all sorts of results. And I'm not sure I would actually advise governments to go out and do that right now. And I wasn't really talking to governments at that stage. I think when governments act, it's important to act based on evidence. And let me talk about some of the evidence on water and child survival. So we recently conducted a meta-analysis on the effect of water treatment on child mortality, working with epidemiologists and biostatisticians. So a meta-analysis combines data from many studies, in our case from 15 different studies, of water treatment in low and middle income countries. And what we found was, we expected some effect on survival. We found a much bigger effect than we expected. We estimate that 1 in 4 child deaths could be averted through water treatment. That means that, for example, in India, if water treatment was delivered universally throughout India, it could save 136,000 child lives every single year. Now, because water treatment is so inexpensive, that means that for a given budget, you can save more lives through spending on water treatment than through almost any other approach. It's right up there with immunizations, for example. Unfortunately, water treatment's often been neglected by the international community. More than 2 billion people still drink contaminated water. Now, the government of India, through its Jal Jeevan mission, has just taken a big step forward and created a huge opportunity for India and indeed for the world. India's government has pledged to bring piped water to every household in rural India. 2/3 of Indian households have already been connected. Once water is delivered through pipes, more than 90% of the cost of delivering safe water is completed. The additional cost of treating the water is tiny by comparison. Inline chlorination devices can automatically treat the water, requiring no moving parts and no electricity. So this is an example of one I saw in India. I was in India and last week I visited sites in Andhra Pradesh, and I saw how impressive the engineering and program design was. Met with local people, healthcare workers, village officials. There was enthusiasm about the program across the board. Then had the opportunity to join a meeting with the secretary of Jal Jeevan Mission and with Evidence Action, who are working closely with JJM to scale up water treatment. Now, I'm not affiliated with the Indian government or with Evidence Action, but I wanted to talk about this as a researcher who's worked on water treatment internationally in many different contexts, because I think this is a particularly exciting opportunity, in particular because of the role of the government. In a country as big as India, only the government is big enough to reach everybody. And I think now is really a critical time for this program. JJM has been made a national priority by the Prime Minister, and the leadership is very impressive. Now that the piped water infrastructure is in place, there's really a critical window of opportunity to have a transformative impact on child health by making sure that even in the single village schemes, the water treatment schemes, that the water is treated. And the government of India is moving towards that goal, and I think if there's anything we can do to support that, we should do it.
Thank you. Your work on water and development is absolutely critical, right? And in fact, it'll get more urgent when we're talking about the water crisis, which is made worse by climate change. Too much, too little, too polluted. And I wanted to bring the conversation to the issue of power imbalance, right? Because obviously, there's an imbalance of power in the sense that the people who are poorest and who may have contributed least to the climate crisis are actually bearing the worst effects.
Yes.
Right? How would you encourage the philanthropists in this room to think about righting this imbalance, right, and the kinds of innovations they should think about when they're trying to look at development issues, especially in less developed places?
Yes, thanks very much. Yes, I think in many countries, those who are well off will have access to safe water, and certainly in high-income countries, people have access to safe water. But Poor people may not have that access, and particularly that access is further threatened by climate change, in several ways. Droughts might mean that safe water sources are no longer available. Rising temperatures can speed multiplication of microorganisms. And as we just heard, when there are floods, among other things, that also means that waterborne disease spreads. And that leads to outbreak of cholera and other illnesses. And one approach is to come after the fact, and that's very important. So often disaster relief organizations will distribute water treatment to households during disasters. And that's really vital work. But it's obviously challenging and very costly. I had an opportunity to speak to a senior Ministry of Health official in a country dealing with the cholera epidemic. And he was explaining how difficult it is to distribute water treatment quickly after the fact. So I think it's very helpful to have systems set up in advance so that water is treated and people have access to that. In India, that might be inline chlorination. In other contexts, it might be delivering services through maternal and child health to make water treatment solution or access to that, just like childhood immunization, something that the system provides automatically for every child.
And am I right to say that it is much cheaper to prevent than to deal with it as an after effect?
Yes, it's much cheaper if you put this in advance. Just to fix ideas, I wouldn't recommend this, especially not with a doctor here, but a bottle of bleach has enough chlorine in it to treat 70,000 liters of water. It's extremely inexpensive. So if you set those systems up in advance and you have the distribution networks there, then you're much less likely to be dealing, for example, with cholera epidemics after these disasters. And that's one of the reasons that the IPCC has called for water chlorination as a climate change adaptation measure. We've seen child mortality come down by half worldwide, in India by 2/3, and I think that if we put systems in place now, we can help ensure that climate change doesn't derail this progress that the global community is making on health.
Thank you, Michael. We've spoken about the nexus between climate and health, climate and community resilience, climate and development issues. And I want to turn to Lian Pin. You're heading the Center for Nature-Based Solutions in the university. And I want to ask if you could share a little bit about the nexus between climate and the ocean. What really is nature-based solutions? Because it's used so often that maybe we all have a slightly different understanding of what it means. And can the ocean actually be a solution to the climate crisis?
Yeah, thanks Kim Hui for that question. I also want to thank the PAA and the Temasek Trust for the opportunity to be part of this panel. Maybe I'll broaden my answer to include not just oceans, but nature in general, so talking about climate and nature. And I'll speak to that in 3 points, I hope to be succinct. One is the what, so what are we actually talking about when we talk about nature-based climate solutions or nature-based solutions? The why we should be paying attention to them, and the how. So nature-based climate solutions are essentially ways of leveraging nature or working with nature to help us address our climate change impacts and challenges. And typically, when we think about NBS for short, we think about 3 buckets of solutions. The first would be conservation. So conserving and protecting the standing natural ecosystems that we have left on our planet. And these would include not just the mangroves that many of us have heard of or heard about, but also the inland forests, forests on mineral soil, forests on peatlands, peat swamp forests, as well as freshwater swamp forests. So we need to do what we can to conserve and protect these ecosystems because they are an important stock of carbon that have been locked away for millions or thousands and millions of years. If we continue to convert these natural ecosystems to other forms of land uses, we would be losing the carbon that they are helping us to lock up and releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, contributing to climate change. So we need to turn off that tap of emissions by protecting and conserving the standing ecosystems. That's the first bucket. The second bucket would refer to opportunities for us to restore or rehabilitate parts of the planet that have already been degraded or maybe have already been deforested through historical deforestation events. By growing new trees, planting new trees and growing new forests, we would be able to capture, or rather the trees would be able to capture CO2, carbon dioxide, from the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis and begin, again, locking them up in their biomass above ground, in their roots below ground, and also in the soil around the forest. So that is also an important bucket of nature-based solutions. And the third bucket of nature-based solutions refers to opportunities for us to improve our practices, especially in the management of our agricultural and forestry lands. Because within those industries, there could be lots of opportunities to, for example, reduce the use of fertilizers, which is a very carbon-intensive agrochemical. There could be opportunities for us to practice agroforestry, and there could even be opportunities for us to have a production/protection approach to our forestry business, which is actually becoming an area of great interest and actually have been already implemented in some of the plantations in our part of the world. So those three buckets of solutions are pertaining to the what. The why, so why should we pay attention to them, especially for the people in this hall? Southeast Asia, and in fact the entire Asia-Pacific region, is an area of very high concentrations of nature-based solutions, opportunities in those three buckets. We still have a lot of standing forests left in this part of the world. Unfortunately, we also have some parts of Southeast Asia that have been degraded, and so there are opportunities to restore and rehabilitate them. And in this part of the world, we also have significant agriculture and forestry industries, which means there is also significant opportunities for these industries to act on nature-based solutions to help us reduce emissions or sequester carbon dioxide. So that is the part about why we should be paying attention to them. The how, so with regards to the how, I think as Kim Hui and others have already alluded to, time is of the essence. We don't have much time left. So what we need to do now is to prioritize. What should we be acting on first? So there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of scope for research, for the research sector, academics, to help governments and businesses identify priorities to act on. For example, which of those buckets of solutions would be most important for your own industry, and within the buckets of, say, conservation solutions or actions, where should we be acting in the region? Which geography should we be focusing on that could get us the highest returns, both in terms of climate mitigation potential, but also perhaps financial returns as well. There could be new opportunities to create growth. And then the other important thing to mention is in terms of the how, is that the research sector, of course, cannot do this alone. We require partnerships. We require partnerships from governments, with businesses, and with civil society, the NGOs, to work together in terms of resourcing, in terms of actually doing the research, but also figuring out how to implement the research and translate the research into meaningful and impactful actions.
Thank you, Lim Pin. And many of us could be thinking about investing into carbon markets, and in fact, even biodiversity credits, as a way to pay for ecosystem services. What is your advice to those of us who are thinking about that?
I think, so both, in terms of both carbon and biodiversity markets, first of all, maybe I would like us to take a step back because there's an important point to understand. When I speak about nature-based solutions, I'm talking about the importance of that set of solutions for us to reduce emissions or remove carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases. To do that, we could be thinking about market-based mechanisms as well as non-market-based mechanisms. So the markets that Kim Hui talks about pertain to market-based mechanisms, obviously. Regardless of whether we are using market-based mechanisms or regulatory mechanisms, we need to implement nature-based solutions because, as I mentioned before, we need to turn off that tap of emissions. Okay, now coming to your question. Nature-based projects and products, especially in this part of the world, is still a very nascent industry. There is still a lot of scope for us to better understand how we can ensure that the interventions that we invest in, including forest carbon projects, really deliver the outcomes that we envision and really carry with them an added value, what we call additionality in this space. That is not an easy task to do. There are lots of different ways to unpack that issue, which I will not go into. But suffice it to say, the industry is nascent, but there's already a lot of research happening and a lot of efforts both by the public sector and the private sector to grow this industry, to grow this set of solutions, and also to grow an ecosystem within Southeast Asia, within Singapore, to support the implementation of nature-based solutions. With regard for carbon. With regards to biodiversity, there's also a lot of interest at the moment. Biodiversity is even more nascent than the carbon market for several reasons, but one important reason is that unlike carbon, biodiversity is even more complicated and more challenging to measure. They are also less fungible than carbon. When you think of carbon, think of a ton of carbon in Singapore, emitted by Singapore, could potentially be offset offset by another ton of carbon that would be captured in a project, say in Colombia. So that is, to some extent, still relatively intuitive and easy to justify and defend. But biodiversity is less so because how do you try to offset the loss of a certain percentage of bird diversity in Indonesia versus conserving a forest that could be important for Y percentage of bird diversity in Brazil? The species are completely different, the ecosystems are completely different, so it's a little bit trickier. But researchers have been working on a solution in terms of trying to measure biodiversity in a standardized way and looking into ways of valuing them so that we can also bring on board market-based mechanisms to help shift capital to implement more biodiversity credit projects around the world, which is also important.
Thank you, Lian Pin. We have 30 seconds left. And today is very much, we talked about intersections of the nexus and connections of various aspects and how there is a need for systems thinking, right? But the reality is we also need to look for the right interventions, ideally low cost, and that can also be implemented in places where there might not be a lot of infrastructure in place. And my parting question to you is, how do we sniff out the acupuncture points? Right, and if you could keep your response very brief, and then we will close the session from there. Jamila. Yeah.
I mean, in a limited time, I would say go back to the people. Sometimes the solutions are there. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. And I always feel that we don't listen enough to particularly indigenous populations and looking for low-cost, high-impact solutions that work for people at that place where they are.
Michael.
I'll follow up on that. I completely agree. You know, as a researcher who works on evaluation and development, I've participated in many studies, I've read many studies, and advised governments and philanthropies on their investments. And one of the reasons why I'm excited about water treatment is, among the many things that I've looked at, this is one of the most cost-effective things. It's about $1,000 per life saved. And then there's the opportunity to support the government of India, which has just such tremendous reach to scale this. So, you know, in my personal charitable giving, I tend to focus on water treatment. You know, there's obviously a lot of very exciting ideas up on the stage, but that's the direction I went.
Thank you. Then Lian Pin.
I see the countdown clock flashing, so I'll be super short. So for me, I think as a researcher and an educator, the pressure point for me would be the training of more socially engaged researchers. I think it is no longer acceptable or responsible for scientists to just be working in their labs and not be concerned or interested in what's happening in the real world. We really need to put in a lot more effort in the training of our master's students, our PhD students, our future research leaders to step out, to engage with the public sector, the private sector, to do more of these kinds of panels so that we can collectively understand the problem that we need to solve, and the researchers can invest in finding solutions and new technologies and innovations to solve them.
Thank you. And on that note, please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you.